Thank you. And thank you, Alison, for the invitation to speak on this panel today. And I very much look forward to the panel and also the input and participation from people here at the Congress. And I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, to pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly welcome First Peoples who may be present today. I'm talking with you today about the health workforce and the effects of migration on the health workforce, with a focus on the ability of health workers, particularly doctors, dentists, nurses and midwives, to meet the needs of the communities in the context of globalisation, the increased movement of capital, the increased movement of labour, the increased movement of professional goods and services. So I'm talking to you today as a sociologist with a background in physiotherapy and an intellectual interest, I suppose, in health workforce governance, of how international organisations, regional bodies, nation states, and even provincial states and territories can respond to these challenges in the context of the right to health, and also the context of the right to move. People in the world enjoy one of the universal human rights is the right to move. So we're talking today in that very much global context with a focus on how to achieve Sustainable Development Goals. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors, Kanchun Marcus and Madan, both of whom actually come from India, either directly or indirectly via Fiji. So I'm working with a multicultural team, and I'm grateful to their input into this work. So let's start by looking at the migration patterns. And in the Sydney Asia Pacific Migration Centre at the University of Sydney, we focus on the Asia Pacific region. We have 2 million highly qualified migrants moving from the Asia Pacific to wealthy OECD countries every year, and Asia Pacific migration is greater than any other region in the world. So we're living in the powerhouse region of the world, where migration from low to middle to high income countries poses ethical challenges, which is generally referred to in the literature as brain drain. And I'm respecting here the new president of the World Congress of Public Health Associations' preference for not using the term development. And I'm really glad to hear that from her, coming from South Africa. I've always had an uneasy relationship with that word. It's a good word to interrogate, but it's not always the most useful way of describing challenges and opportunities. So I'm referring to the World Bank categories here rather than the term development. And of course, we're also looking at migration within countries, particularly from rural urban areas, which puts further stresses on access to healthcare in rural and remote areas. So let's look at the health workforce more generally and globally, where it's estimated that there are approximately 4.4 million health workers, with approximately 10 million physicians, 21 million nurses and midwives, and 13 million other health workers, including allied health workers such as physiotherapists, which, as I said, is my own background. Health professionals, we know, are vital for a community. They are first on the ground in fighting preventable disease outbreaks. Sociologically, we also know they're crucial in communities to provide leadership, social capital networks, and supporting local institutions such as hospitals, schools, post offices, banks, libraries, and so on. And the Asia Pacific countries have various economic, financial, political, cultural and ecological challenges that we'll be referring to more fully in the panel today. So let's look at some data from the World Health Statistics, from the World Health Report. And we're looking here at the World Health Organization regions for 2000 to 2013, the median density of the health workforce per 10,000 population. And what we can see here is Europe enjoys the highest or the most satisfactory densities of health professionals, but we're coming close to the Americas with a respectable proportion of nurses and midwives. That's the ochre column or row, and with also a respectable proportion of doctors to population. But you'll see there in the top column in the top column that we have a significant dearth or shortage of dentists in the Western Pacific region, and that's the region in which Australia is located. So to sort of highlight the main points about the Asian Pacific workforce and densities, we have more than the global average of nurses and midwives per 10,000 population. The Western Pacific region, as I've emphasised, has particular worries and concerns in terms of shortages and the maldistribution of dentists. The Southeast Asian region reports the lowest densities for nurses and midwives, and there's also problems with the shortages and distribution of doctors in the southeastern region. So we've talked about shortages. Now I now want to address the problems of maldistribution within the Asia-Pacific region. Workforce shortages and maldistribution are most acute in Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste and Myanmar, the former Burma. There are particular challenges with maldistribution in the Pacific Islands, Fiji, the Marshall Islands, New Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. And in fact, the Western Pacific Regional Office of the World Health Organization has commissioned our WHO Collaborating Centre at the University of Sydney to do some work with the Marshall Islands currently in relation to needs for rehabilitation workforce. And the shortages of maldistribution are also acute in Pacific Island countries such as Papua New Guinea, Kiribati and so on, which, as I've emphasised, I think I've said this 3 times already, but you know I'm passionate about access to oral health, have particular issues in terms of access to oral health. So in Australia, Australia reports some of the highest percentages of migrant health professionals in the world. I think we come second only to Israel in terms of our reliance on overseas trained health professionals. The government, the Commonwealth Department of Health and Immigration, the government generally has a goal of domestic self-sufficiency set by the Australian Health Ministers in 2025, but we do have significant workforce gaps and significant problems with maldistribution, particularly in attracting and retaining health professionals in rural and remote areas, and also working in socially disadvantaged suburbs, particularly the outer suburbs of large cities such as Sydney and Melbourne. So we're highly dependent on skilled migrants, particularly in rural and remote areas and those underserved areas such as aged care. From the 2011 census, we know that about 60% of dentists in Australia were born overseas, half medical practitioners were born overseas, and 30% of nurses. And those figures are more pronounced the further you go away from the major teaching hospitals. So in rural and remote areas, we're relying on a majority of overseas trained or overseas born health professionals. What are the source countries? The main source countries are India, particularly for dentists, the Philippines, particularly for nurses, and increasingly China. So India, the Philippines and China remain the dominant source countries for migrant health professionals in Australia. And I'm very reassured, actually. I know there's a lot of criticism of the Sustainable Development Goals and how they've been framed and their implications, but I couldn't have framed this any better. I think it's a brilliant goal in this area, following on from the WHO Code of Practice on Ethical Recruitment of Health Professionals. And I just couldn't say this any better in terms of how we collectively, internationally, regionally, nationally and locally should be addressing workforce shortages and maldistribution in order to meet Sustainable Development Goals, to substantially increase health financing and recruitment, development, training and retention of the health workforce in developing countries, especially in least developed countries and small island developing states. So in terms of take-home recommendations from this panel and from this Congress, I'm very fortunate indeed that the Sustainable Development Goals have really narrowed in on what the problem is and how we can address it collectively. So what should the focus of our attention be? Firstly, it should be small island developing states as a priority, and I'm going to rely on my colleague Linda Selby to provide more elaboration of that. Basically, all the Pacific islands other than Australia and New Zealand, particularly including small islands in Papua New Guinea, are small island developing states. So we're in the region of the world that's particularly vulnerable in the context of climate change. Plus, we need to address serious workforce shortages and maldistribution in the Pacific Islands, Fiji, the Marshall Islands, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and in Asia, Timor-Leste, Myanmar, and Myanmar. So I've published some work in this area already. In particular, I'd like to bring your attention to the paper I've published with colleagues in the Asia Pacific Journal of Health Management on health workforce migration in the Asia Pacific, if you'd like to follow up this work. I very much welcome the opportunity to contribute to the discussion in this panel, and it's slightly tangential, but it is relevant. I just wanted to mention here also that I'm currently conducting a large ARC discovery project, which is actually comparing and contrasting the migration policies of Australia and Canada, because Australia and Canada are destination countries. We're actually competing for the same talent internationally. Potentially we're contributing to the brain drain rather than brain gain or brain circulation. So with colleagues in Canada, we're comparing and contrasting our immigration policies, and hopefully with a view to informing the Canadian and Australian governments about more effective governance of the health workforce in the context of these global challenges in the future. Thank you.